You're listening to This Cockeyed War podcast, the story of Lieutenant Albert Edwin Haines, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment, 9th Infantry Division. Chapter 2. I dig and pray with the best of them. Dad, I'd like us to talk a little bit about Grandpa on the front lines. Really starting from him being placed on the front lines in Zweitfall or Schevenhütte.
Schevenhütte is where the division headquarters was. He moved forward, I think, to Zweitfall or somewhere around there. And that's where his platoon is located. He and Sergeant Anderson are getting to know each other a little bit.
Perfect. If we could, before we dive in, could you briefly describe like the command structure of the Army, just going all the way down to the platoon leader, which is where Grandpa was, and then just describe what a platoon looks like how how many are in a platoon, what are the ages? We can talk a little bit about those dynamics. Who are the people that are living with him on his right and his left?
All right. So starting at the top of the theater, so to speak, the commanders, the generals. First of all, you have to understand this is coalition warfare where you have allies with allies and you're trying to help each other and figure out who's going to do what to whom and how they're going to do it and all that other kind of stuff. And that's sort of at the political level. But the difference between the political level, between the President of the United States, who is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then you've got Churchill in Britain. And then you sort of have this character called Charles de Gaulle, who is Free French, but, who are they and what are they doing? And then you've got the Soviet Union under Stalin, and he's coming in from the Eastern Front. But we're focused right now on the Americans on the Western Front in Europe. And their command structure is you have the Supreme Allied Commander, who is Dwight David Eisenhower. He's a 5-star general, and he's the overall guy in charge. And he has to deal with the political leaders and all the stuff that goes with that. So he's got a political role, but mostly it's being in command of all the forces. And so he's responsible to make sure that the theater is divided up, that he knows what's going on, and the big picture is what the enemy's doing. He needs to keep in mind what the objective is and where he's going. And up there with him at the Supreme Allied Command headquarters, you have what's called a Land Forces Commander. And sometimes it's just one person, like when they landed in Normandy, Montgomery from the British side of the equation, he was the Land Forces Commander. Once they hit the beach and got more forces in, you got to have more command. You have to have more organizational structure. So when Grandpa gets where he's going, the basic structure goes something like this: you got General Eisenhower at the top. You have Army group commanders, and they would be people like General Omar Bradley, the United States Army, General Montgomery of the British Army, and I think there may have been another one, but I can't remember, but I think those are the two main ones. Under the Army group commanders, you've got, and what happened then is they would divide the theater between the two Army group commanders. And so Montgomery was more to the north, Bradley was to the south, and in those Army groups, you then have what are called armies. And there's Army commanders, and they're 3-star generals. There's a 4-star and 3-star generals. And they command groups, like Patton commands an army. There's some other people out there that command armies, and I can't remember all their names. And then in the armies, you have corps. Those are commanded by 3-star generals. And the corps is a headquarters that has usually under it 2 to 4 divisions, which are commanded by major generals, 2-star generals. And underneath the divisions, you've got the regiments. And Grandpa right now is in the 47th Infantry Regiment, which belongs to the 9th Infantry Division. And so then below the regiment, making up the regiment, you have battalions. And usually there's 3 battalions. Also in the regiment, there's usually a battalion of artillery and some other ancillary forces that they need, like maybe a squad of MP or a company of MPs or, whatever it may be that they need to have some specific things done. And often these units get attached to the regiment, below the battalion. So that's regiment to battalion. And then the battalions, and we're talking about where we're getting down where Grandpa was. In the battalions, you've got usually 4 companies in a battalion. And the way they numbered them back in those days is 1st battalion, they would call red because it was red, white, and blue. So the 1st battalion was red, and they had company A, B, C, and D. Now, A, B, and C were infantry platoon or infantry companies. D was a heavy weapons company, and they had heavier machine guns and bazookas and stuff like that. In the infantry companies, you've got 3 platoons, and in each platoon, there's about 3 to 4 squads of 10 to 11 men each. So Grandpa, being a platoon leader, commands 4 squads of 10, 20, 30, 40 some soldiers, assuming it's full strength. He also has what's called a platoon headquarters, which is him, his platoon sergeant, a radio operator. They call them platoon guides, which are sort of like runners and scouts to run things back to company headquarters and run things out to the squad leaders. And sometimes they had an automatic rifle guy with them to give them a little bit more push and oomph. And basically that's the organization. Does that sort of flesh that out for you?
Yeah. So essentially, Grandpa, as the lieutenant, 22 years old, is put in this position in charge of 40 men.
Yeah.
Do each of the squads have a squad leader, or what's his relationship to the sergeant, and what's his relationship to the squads?
Great question, because every unit in the military has a leader. So Grandpa's the platoon leader. He's a lieutenant. He's got a platoon sergeant who's a mid-level non-commissioned officer who understands what it means to be a soldier. In essence, the way you think about officers and non-commissioned officers, or officers and sergeants, is the officer focuses mostly on what is the mission. So he goes back to the company commander, for example, and gets the mission, who got the company's mission from the battalion, who got the battalion's mission from the regiment, and up it goes. And so it sort of gets passed down and developed and worked on. And so the sergeants, or the non-commissioned officers, their job is to focus on the men, making sure that they're taken care of, they're trained and ready, they know their jobs, they follow orders, those kinds of things. And so between the officer, Grandpa, the lieutenant, and the non-commissioned officer, in this case, Sergeant Anderson, the platoon sergeant, they have to work together, because you can't accomplish the mission without the soldiers, and the soldiers don't know what to do without the mission. And so it's one of these it's an interesting superior follower relationship. And any new infantry lieutenant or any officer worth his salt is going to listen really closely to his senior non-commissioned officer for what he's going to tell him about the troops, because he can't get the job done without the soldiers. And one of the great strengths of the American Army, as well as most Western armies, is the caliber and quality of the non-commissioned officer corps, and how they're able to make things happen with the soldiers. So that's the platoon level. You go down, so So you got the platoon leader, the platoon sergeant, then you got these 4 squads, and each squad has a squad leader. And he's going to be a less senior non-commissioned officer, usually a sergeant, a buck sergeant, 3 stripes. He may have a corporal who's like an assistant squad leader, except usually they put him in charge of what they call fire teams. They take the squad usually and they divide it in 2. So you have 4 or 5 guys on one fire team and 4 or 5 guys on another fire team. And they learn how to maneuver together to support each other if they're in an advance or how the defense works or that kind of stuff. And then you've got soldiers. And in a typical infantry squad, you've got they're all carrying, almost all of them are carrying M1 rifles, which in World War II was a pretty good weapon. It was, if I remember right, it could fire, when you fired, it would eject the shell casing and allow the next shell to feed in. So you can get a certain semi-automatic, you just can't go bang, bang. You can go bang, 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 but it wouldn't be a machine gun because you had to pull the trigger every time. But still, that was pretty good. You didn't have to stop and reload and throw the bolt back and put another round in and chamber it and all that other kind of stuff. So it was a pretty good weapon. And so most infantrymen had the M1 rifle. I was reading an article just the other day about how some people thought that the pistol was worthless, although Grandpa really wanted one, and we can talk about that later. But the M1 rifle is what everybody carried. There was also, I think it was in each squad or assigned to each squad, a automatic rifleman, which was a little bit more firepower than just the M1 rifle. And basically that was it. That was the armor. Now you have sometimes you'd have that 4th squad would be a sort of a weapon squad, and they might have a machine gun or 2 to give appropriate fire support to the platoon. But really that was about the extent of the organization of a platoon. So the company basically has the same kind of a posture, just, the platoons. They have a heavy weapons platoon, which has some heavier stuff in it other than the machine guns that you get in the weapon squads. If you go back up to the regiment, you go to the regiment, they usually have a light artillery battalion attached to them, and each battery, which is similar to a company, would sort of be given the role of supporting the battalion with artillery fire. So you get that kind of a combined arms desire to get the maximum effect out of the weapons that you have. So
let's talk a little bit. When Grandpa first arrives, I'll read this quote, and it's interesting. This is in this Cockeyed War, really starting at 13.
Yeah.
The first time he encounters, I'm assuming mortar fire, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it was some other sort of bombing. Oh, I guess it was mortar fire because that's what it says in the report. Anyways, he says, I jumped into the nearest shell crater, pulled the old steel helmet around my ears, and hugged my knees and old Mother Earth for all I was worth, and then immediately got my little old GI shovel unlimbered until I had me a nice hole just outside my door. My patriarchal blessing makes certain definite promises, but it also says in the good books that the Lord is not to be tested. Therefore, I dig and pray with the best of them. Some philosophy. What? I think it's interesting reading through this. You see in the report, there's an exchange of mortar and artillery fire, and continued steadily, and then even up higher, it says, the battalion had a static holding position. And it's interesting to hear Grandpa's perspective, whereas that first time he encounters mortar fire, it's shocking and he's hugging Mother Earth. But then as time goes on, it just becomes part of his life. And I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah. I don't think you become calloused.
Right.
I think you just go, I don't have to write home about it because this is not a new experience anymore. And so, if I buy the farm, I buy the farm, and I don't have to tell anybody about it. And in some ways, I think too, you look at these letters and you go, he's writing back to mom, to grandma, and I think he feels a little bit bad sometimes when all he talks about is how messed up and how dangerous and how horrible and miserable and all that other kind of stuff. And he's got nothing good to say about much of anything because he's nothing much is happening that's good other than the fact that he's still alive. He's got a Father in heaven that loves him. And he's got a promise that if he does what he's supposed to do, everything's going to be worked out fine. And so, yeah.
Let's talk about some of the highlights during this period of time that we're talking about. This is starting in really early October 1944 through Thanksgiving on into December when he's moved.
Yeah, he's assigned, as I understand it, he's assigned as platoon leader on the 7th of October. So
right.
We're into October now, that's for sure. And it's getting cold, wet, and muddy.
Here's one thing that I thought was interesting, and some of these Talmadge wanted to talk about too. There's times when his platoon, and he's in G platoon, is used as a distraction for other companies who are attacking. So, and it's funny to read these reports. You can read the 47th operation reports saying Company G staged a demonstration with machine guns and mortars from their position at, and they give the position, in order to create a diversion for the attack by Company E. And you go down to Grandpa's journal, and he says...
What page are you on?
This is page 19.
Okay.
And Grandpa says, "We were suckers for another attack by drawing distracting fire. Few casualties, none close by." So it's just funny seeing the reaction from Grandpa saying our role is suckers, I guess is what they call it, or the men call it amongst themselves, to be a distraction. Can you talk a little bit about those strategic dynamics and how they're playing out on the front lines at this point in the war?
Well, it's interesting. Diversionary attacks, which is really, or diversionary demonstrations or attacks, whatever you want to call them, are a standard planning mechanism in any military operation, no matter how big or small it may be, because you want to draw the enemy's attention away from what you really want to do, because it increases the possibility that the whole mission will succeed. Unfortunately, when you do that, you've got to put somebody out there to be the sucker, if you will, to use Grandpa's words, to draw the enemy's attention and be the distraction from what's really going to happen, that's going to end up ultimately, hopefully, surprising the enemy, kicking their butts and taking the mission where they needed to go. And so it's pretty discouraging to have to get up and do that. In fact, if in my review of this particular part of what's going on, Grandpa is blessed, and he doesn't know it now. But you look back on it now, and you can see that he's being watched over. He's being kept safe. Otherwise, you or I wouldn't be here. When he was assigned to the 9th Infantry Division in the first part of October, the 9th Infantry Division was deeply involved, or quickly becoming deeply involved, in what became known as the Hurtgen Forest. And it was a mess. The Allies wanted to push through the Hurtgen Forest. The Germans said, "If you want to do it, sure, but it's going to cost you a lot." And it did, because the Hurtgen Forest is a thick place, lots of trees, lousy trails, mud, rain, ravines, thick forest you can't just walk through. And basically the Hurtgen Forest campaign, if you read about it, chewed up the 9th quite a bit, the 9th Division, the 25th Division. I think it was the 25th Division. It had a red bucket on its arm, and they called it the Bloody Bucket Division because it kept getting chewed up by these horrible offenses that would be involved. And anyway, Grandpa, when he's assigned to the 9th, he's up in the 47th Infantry Regiment area, which is in the northern part of the Hurtgen Forest. And they were not nearly as deeply involved in the ugliness of the thicker forests to the south where the other two regiments of the division were. And in fact, what ultimately happened, and you read about this later, we can get to that later, those two regiments were pulled out, as was the 9th Division, to recuperate and rebuild. The 47th was left in line and attached to the 1st Infantry Division. And a little bit later, when we talk about Frenzburg, they were also then later attached to the 3rd Armored Division, while the rest of the 9th Division, those regiments in the 9th Division, were still down there recuperating. So it's just an interesting dynamic. Grandpa, in hindsight, was in the right places at the right times to not get killed, if I can just say it that way. So he talks about in here, and he's also a green lieutenant. I mean, he's not leading any advances or any charges or anything else. Basically, he's sitting in the safety of his defensive position, learning what it means to be an infantry lieutenant, learning what it means to be a leader of 40 men and his chain of command and his sergeants, learning all that stuff, picking it up as quickly and as fast as he possibly can, going out on a patrol every once in a while, making a diversionary attack or demonstration, for lack of a better way to say it. And he's not being put really grossly taking offensive action to put himself in harm's way. And so, and again, as I was reading this part here, I thought, again, we're here today because of where Grandpa was assigned and what he was doing. And he's right. He had to do what he needed to do to survive and live. And I think he managed to do that. And he talks about also after being here for probably most of October into the first part of November, he makes some comment in here. I can't remember exactly where it was, where he says, I need some exercise. I'm going to go out on a patrol for no other reason. I need some exercise. And even in a defensive position, you have to be somewhat offensive. You have to be out there sending out patrols, checking on the enemy, moving your positions around so the enemy doesn't know where you really are, and those kinds of things. And so he had an opportunity to really have the pace needed to learn what he needed to learn for what was later going to come. And I think it's a blessing that this happened. So you read about him shaving with cold water, finding a Coleman stove, I think they said, and tried to heat some water. And you talked about last time about how he left his mustache on because that's much less that he has to shave, and how he's got he can't change his clothes. And I think he even writes in here a little bit later about taking a bath. And from what I read, there's some German sniper over there playing games with him. If you read it, and you go, and anyway, he's getting his feet muddy, and finally he says, "Okay, I've had enough of this," and he runs. He takes over, runs back over the hill. Anyway, it's just sort of interesting and humorous that he has figured out enough of what's going on that he feels that he can run the risk in a defensive position, if you will, to go take a bath in a cold creek, and so because he's what's worse. He's got mud, he's dirty, he's filthy, he can't shave, he can't bathe, he feels gross, he's always wet, he's probably his feet are always cold and wet, and it's miserable. So sometimes you go, I need to break this misery, but when I do that, I may put myself in harm's way. What's the risk worth? And I guess it just got to the point where Grandpa said, I got to get out of this stuff. And the other thing, too, that I find interesting, and I hadn't really really remembered this, but he writes to Mom, and says, you need to send me 3 sets of temple garments every time you send me a package, at least once a month. I can wear them for 4 or 5 days, but it's too hard to get them laundered. So then I throw them away and I change. So he's not... There may be a laundry facility, but he's not getting to them to get them clean. And if he does, it's not going to be garments. It's going to be everything else that's got to get cleaned. And so it's just, it's just interesting the way you learn to deal with the misery of war, even as we sit back today, and he probably sat back and said, I'm glad it went the way it did because I learned how to do what I needed to do when it got really crazy. It's like the challenges that Nephi faced in the Book of Mormon. Every challenge he faced with his brothers got harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. So they start out with the easy ones. Grandpa, in essence, sort of had the same sort of trajectory. He was in defensive, learned more, learned a little bit more, learned more, and then it just gets, anyway, so it's a progression.
Yeah, some of these stories of him in this position that I think help build on his experience, specifically like his leadership experience. There's a point where he talks about that they see a deer come out.
Oh.
And they shoot the deer, and then they take the risk again to go gather the deer.
Yeah.
And then he looked all around his platoon and nobody knew how to dress a deer. And so he took the role of dressing the deer. And everybody's very excited about this deer because it's some fresh meat that they can add to their rations, right? So you can kind of see him kind of forming a relationship with his platoon. Be like, oh, Lieutenant Haines just dressed this deer for us to all eat, right? And I think you're very right. Like being in a defensive position, I mean, there is a lot of hurry up and waiting.
Oh, yeah.
You're sitting and you're trying to get your, foxhole to be drier or whatnot. But you're also doing these activities and trying to be active enough to kind of learn the ropes, as you put it, as being a lieutenant.
That story about the deer is interesting because when I first saw that, when we were working on the book, I thought, my dad never took us hunting. We never learned the skill of how to hunt deer. And I thought, this has got to be a fake story. I've never seen my dad dress a deer before. And so I wrote to his younger brother, Uncle Fell, and I have the letter somewhere. I can't find it in my notes. And Uncle Fell wrote me a letter or an email back. I think it was an email. And he described to me a time when Grandpa went out. They got this deer. They brought the deer back. They hoisted it up in the shed, bled it, sliced it, skinned it, and basically Uncle Fell said, yes, your dad knew how to dress a deer. And you read his account here and you go, nobody else in his platoon knew how to dress a deer. And you say, where'd all these guys come from? New York? Atlanta? None of them came from a place where you hunt deer? And here's my dad. And I learned a lot about him reading that account. Yep. And he also did a little later on. I think they got 3 deer or something like that. So anyway.
Yeah, let's talk about the different men. There's a lot of accounts during this time of Grandpa interacting with the men, specifically about the different moral framework that they work with. In fact, the first time that Grandpa gets to go to a Protestant church service, he talks about how relieved he is to finally hear some pious words for once, because most of the time he's sitting with these guys who are, giving crude jokes, talking about their escapades with women or whatnot. And it's interesting to see how Grandpa is dealing with these different personalities, types, backgrounds, and really trying to put his foot in the ground or a stake in the ground and defend his faith and his loyalty to his wife, to Grandma. Let me read a little part. This is skipping ahead quite a bit, but on page 110, he talks about, discussions with Lieutenant Gove and other officers about pleasures versus faithfulness. So he talks about this other lieutenant, I'm assuming a lieutenant of another platoon? Are they all in the same kind of officers' quarters or area?
Probably another platoon, and they're back in the back somewhere having talks or whatever. Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, he says that Lieutenant Gove, he is a firm believer in capturing all the temporal pleasures of life that are immediately available, while I stand on the rampart that my deepest comfort and happiness comes from having faith and being faithful to the woman that I love, and that woman alone. And then he says he nor the other officers just can't see it that way, maintaining that sooner or later I shall fall to the wills of some Parisian babe, and they are even willing to wager money between themselves over my faith in these ideals. And he goes on to say how their arguments become quite heated, and he's very much outnumbered. So, again, just to remind us how these platoons are formed in the first place, going back to our last episode, it's just kind of the flow of recruits coming in. It's not like back in the Civil War time you have the 21st Massachusetts or something like that, right? It's people from all over. Is that by design, or is that just kind of how the Army is operating at this point?
I think as we talked last week, it's pretty much how they're operating. Ideally, what you want to do is do like they did in World War One, where you train the unit, you send the whole unit over, and they fight as a group, and they do what they're supposed to do. World War II started off that way. You train as a unit, you get deployed, you go out and you fight as a unit. And you look at the history of the 9th Infantry Division, they came to North Africa, they fought together, they went up Sicily, they fought together, they came and landed at Normandy, they fought together. But by the time you're in Normandy and you've had all these casualties, everybody's had casualties, like we talked. So now they're just sending individual replacements forward and filling in the holes. And it goes back to the whole discussion we had about who wants to get to know the new guy, because he may die tomorrow or the next week. In fact, one of the sad stories about the Battle of the Bulge, and we can talk about that when we get to it, is how many new guys died, nobody even know who they were, let alone keep track of them. So, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. And in some ways, being in a defensive position like Grandpa was, he had the opportunity to learn who these people were. And having said that, he may not have embraced their morals at all, but he had to embrace who they were and what they were there to do, because that's what he was there to do. And so you have to learn to get along with people that you may spiritually and emotionally abhor, but you've got to develop a camaraderie with them, because you got a job to do. You can't do it by yourself. And so, you got to love everyone in some respects. I think too, it's interesting to see his reaction to the liquor ration that officers were allowed to have, and how when he had his first when he first knew about it, they sent a note out and said all the officers can come and get their liquor ration. So he goes in, and it's just these lieutenants and captains back there just getting drunk, and it drives him crazy. And I think he would take the liquor ration, and I think he'd use it for bartering and stuff like that, but obviously he didn't ever drink it. And in fact, I guess there was some discussion somewhere about we need to stop the liquor ration, and Grandpa said, yeah, they should. It's just a waste. And if you know what? They didn't have it when I was in the Army. So
you couldn't take advantage of that liquor ration.
Yeah.
It's too bad. What other stories or events happening during this time do you want to talk about or kind of expand on?
I want to tell just a real quick one. There's a note. I can't remember exactly what page it was on. I think it was on page 27. He talks about a book. And what I found interesting about this, and when I was doing the transcription, he says right here on page 27, October 16th, rain and overcast. This is from his journal. Read all day, quote, February Hill. Not good and not bad. Artillery steady roll. Slept fitful finally with lots of dreams about Felda. I looked at that and I thought, February Hill. What is that? Well, it turns out that what they did in World War II, so I can find it, I made some notes on this. What they did during World War II is they had a program. It was called When Books. Oh, I read a book about it because I was so interested in this. Basically, February's Hill is a novel that was written in paperback, printed for the troops. Well, it was printed for everybody, but the government printed it for the troops and sent it forward sort of like they did movies and those kinds of things. So they sent it forward, and I guess Grandpa got a copy of this book, February Hill. And so when I saw this, I thought, I'd like to know what that book is about. So I saw that I could get it through BYU loan, but I wasn't a student. So if I remember right, we were living in Riverton at the time, on Dancy, and I reached out to Joshua because he was going to school at the time, and I said, can you get this book for me through your library privileges? And he did. And so I read the book. And I agree with Grandpa. It's neither good nor bad. It's a book. And in some ways, it's good to have a book when you're sitting in a defensive position and you got some time, a little bit of time on your hands, and you can fill in some of the gaps. But what I found fascinating too is as I learned more about these books that were going out, there's just a lot of interesting aspects to it. One of the books that was published, it was a Zane Grey story. It was called Riders of the Purple Sage. And apparently, let me just read my little note here. It says, a Western, this book by Zane Grey, whose heroine befriends gunslinging cowboys who urges her to break away from the evils of the Mormon Church. It was on the verge of being printed as an Armed Forces edition. That's the thing they're talking about, the ASE, Armed Forces edition book, when a reader objected because of its, quote, bitter attack on Mormons, close quote. Army Service Edition policy was not to publish books that might be, quote, offensive to any religious group, close quote. So the book was not published, which I thought was interesting. But the other aspect of this whole thing about Armed Services Edition, there's also another book out there. It was called Forever Amber and Strange Fruit. 2 books, Forever Amber, and the other book is Strange Fruit. I didn't read either one of these books because basically what I read here says books are most read. The books that are most read are books that are, to put it bluntly, sex and a lot of it. So I thought, that's for another book I want to read. But it's an interesting, as you look at the dynamic of what's going on with liquor rations and books that they give and that kind of stuff, that's some of the aspects and the dynamics of how the home front was trying to support the battlefront with touches of home and opportunities and choices that they may have had. I mean, you got movies, you got USO shows, you got those kinds of things. And it's just interesting the way the nation pulled together to fight this war. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because it's an opportunity. So
I should also mention too, like speaking of the home front, food is a big deal. Grandpa talks about food all the time in his letters, asking for food. Please send anything to break up the rations that they have.
And what's interesting about that is when I came in the Army, in the meal ready to eat, and sometimes even in the C rations that I used to get, they'd have a little flask of Tabasco sauce because the food is usually just bland. And so the little flask of Grandpa didn't have that in World War II. We did, and it was always nice to go, I'm going to put this on my salad just because I want to taste some. Of course, you didn't get a salad. What am I saying? Never mind. Everything came out of a can.
Great. I mean, there's so much to cover in this period of time. So I encourage our listeners to look up and to read some of these stories, things that we didn't quite talk about, but are kind of part of, I guess, Grandpa's learning and growing experience as a lieutenant. They capture 5 prisoners, German prisoners at one point. There's a moment of Grandpa writing to Grandma on German paper that has holes in it. Handkerchiefs with similar holes, which is dark and ominous. I just can't imagine how Grandma feels reading some of these things. He talks about an election ballot that came late and he threw it in the fire after filling it out because the election was already over. You get a lot of Grandpa's personality through all of these things. And I'm noticing too, as we get deeper and deeper into November, the operation reports get more and more complicated, more and more busy as different operations are starting to move here and there. Action is taking place. You can even see notes on casualties coming up. So things are getting serious, and we'll start covering some of Grandpa in action at our next chapter.
From defense to offense.
Anything else, Dad?
Nope, I think that'll do her. We'll jump into this again next week.
This Cockeyed War is an SMC production. It is hosted and edited by me, Nathan Haines. My dad, retired Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Allen Haines, was the featured guest in this episode. The opening bugle call was Church from the U.S. Army Bands Online. Closing music is by Talmadge Haines.